Hello everyone. So in this video I will show you how you can use two different databases in a single Spring Boot application. So what I have here now is a very simple Spring Boot application. So I have just imported the Spring Boot's data GPA module and the MySQL connector. We will be using MySQL, an external database, to see our results. So what I have here at the moment, I have my entities. So I have a user entity and a product entity. So they are both very simple. I mean, just an ID, two fields, and my constructor and the empty constructor for JPA. I have my repositories for each entity, user repository and product repository. My database is defined as follows. So this is the coordinates of my database. It's a local MySQL database. And these two properties, they are not mandatory for H2, for example, but for MySQL, you have to add them. And finally, our entry point, our main class, where I have my init method that is called after the build of the application, and I just create and persist my entities. So let's run our program. Oops. So this is the database I'm using right now, only this one. So our program indeed created our table product, our table user. And let's see the data inside. So our entity was persisted in user, and let's see product. And we have our entity in product as well. So what I want to do now is to persist each one of these in two different databases. So I want product to be in one database and user to be in another database. So let's see our databases. Okay, CodeIgnore-DB1 will be used for user, and now we will use CodeIgnore-DB2 to store the products. So what we have to do now is to separate the entities and the repositories. Each one should belong to a single package. So let's create our package for each one of them. And the same for repository. Okay, second thing, we need to create configuration classes for each of our data source. So let's create the first one for the first data source. So which will store the user. For example, let's call it user db. We could find a better name, but let's stay with this. User db configuration. Oops, this should be the one. No. So this is a Spring configuration. For this database configuration, we will enable the transaction management and we will enable our repositories. Okay, we will add some arguments here later. So what I want to say is, when right now, by using this single database, Spring did a lot of things for us to make things easier. And in fact, what's happening behind the scenes, Spring created our data source from these key values, and then it created an entity manager factory and a transaction manager for this data source, and this all behind the scenes, so the developer doesn't have to care about this. If we want to use two databases, then the user has to create these classes, to create these beans manually, and this is what we are doing right now. So let's create our data source. So how I like to do it is to create data source properties bean. So this is a bean. Here's the new data source properties. Okay, so this is right now empty. We will tell Spring to build our bean using this data here, and this is made with the configuration properties annotation, and we give it these suffixes here. So here we are creating two databases, so I would like to separate 1 and 1, and our second data source 2, 2, 2, and here we have 2. I think I don't miss anything. Okay, and then for the first data source we give this prefix. Okay, so this is a this is a data source properties. This is not yet the data source itself. Let's create a data source now. Here's a data source. This is also a bean, and let's return. takes as argument our data source properties here. As we will have two data sources and two data source properties for the I just want to make sure that we inject the right bean, and by using this qualifier, and we'll give it the name of our data source. And that's it. Okay. And from here we use our builder from the TS properties. Initialize our source builder and just will build. It already has everything. Next, the entity manager factory. Here we use a local container entity manager factory B. User db factory. There we will inject our data source again. Oops. And an entity manager factory builder, and this one is provided by Spring himself, and it will inject this bean automatically. As we will have again a second data source later, let's make sure we inject the correct data source by using our qualifier. So here the names of the beans, they match, okay. And from there we return the data source. So we give it our user data source. And here we give it the package of the beans of the entities that will be managed by this entity manager. So here we give it the user entities. So we can give it either the class or we give it the package name. I like to give it the class in case we move our entities. And then we build. Okay, and finally we build the transaction manager. Transaction manager user yes transaction. Okay, as we will have a second configuration which will hold again another data source. Spring needs here a primary data source, so we mark this as a primary. The data source as well, and the transaction manager. Okay, so this is for the first data source. We have our entity manager factory, which will produce an entity manager, and our transaction manager. Now we will do the same for the product configuration. So it will be very similar. So I will pause the video and come back when it's created. Okay, so this is our product DB configuration for our second database. And it's very similar to the first one, so we make sure that we removed the primary annotation because we decided that the user DB will be the primary data source. And what is missing is the arguments I was talking about here in the JPA repository. So again, we define the base package for our user repositories. So we'll take the repository where this class belong, that class, entity manager factory reference, this one, and our transaction manager reference, which is this one. So here is the second product DB configuration. It's very similar to the first one. I added the JPA repository arguments, so the base package of our product repository, the entity manager, and the transaction manager, as they are defined here. And I corrected a little typo here. I used DataSource instead of DB. And for user, we have the same. So let's run our program now. Okay, let's persist this pin as well. And let's see in the database. So in this database, we have only one table, which is correct. Which holds the right data. Let's see the second database, DB2, show tables, correct, and let's see. Okay, so now we managed to persist our entities in two different databases by using these configuration classes. So as you can see, except moving the entities and the repositories to different packages, I mean to split them from the same package, we didn't change our code. Another thing I would like to mention is about this hibernate relationships like one-to-many, one-to-one, etc. Some people, by using two different databases, still wants to have those relationships. Let's say user wants to have many products, one-to-many products. This is not possible here. Why? Because entities should be managed by the same persistence unit. If they are managed by the same persistence unit, then yes, you can use the one-to-many, many-to-many relationships. Here, each one of the entities is managed by a different persistence unit. That's why you cannot use such relationships. It is possible to merge two persistence units into one and thus use such kind of relationships, but this is out of the scope of this tutorial. So I hope it was clear, and if you have any questions or something needs to be more detailed, then please just ask. Thank you very much.